Yeah, so we kind of touched on this before we started recording, which is that there's obviously this very interesting, questionable cancel culture, right? Which feeds into a culture of having to be perfect all the time. And you see this a lot in the environmental space. It's like this real kind of like puritanism around having to do all of the things. And if you aren't doing all of the things, then you're doing something wrong. And it's very black and white, and it's very isolating, I suppose. And I know that a lot of young people don't take action on the issues they care about for fear of judgment from their peers. If they do have some of those inconsistencies or are perceived as being hypocritical. And so one of the things that I've really owned in my own kind of path as an activist is actually not celebrating those inconsistencies, but recognizing that they're part of a much bigger problem, right? The climate crisis is the symptom of broken systems, from, the clothes on my back to the food in my fridge or how I get around the city. And so each and every one of us, by the nature of existing in the 21st century, is contributing to this challenge. That makes it super unique. And it also means that it's impossible to do all of the things and tick all of the boxes. Now, a lot of executives, a lot of people who come from, outside this kind of activism world are hyper aware of their own inconsistencies and are hyper aware of the fact that they might be othered because they're in a particular position. And so the way we've been able to facilitate some of these conversations is to start from a place of vulnerability, and to start from a place not of, okay, I'm on my mighty high ground and this real kind of savior complex, but to start from a baseline of, I'm inconsistent, right? I care really deeply about these problems, but I make mistakes, right? And I wish I could do all of the things, but I don't. And when you open up in that way, and you have the kind of courage to not feel that you need to hold up this facade of being perfect, and you don't come from a place of pointing out, but from a place of pointing in, and like recognizing your own fallibility and your own inconsistencies, it creates the spaces for other people to also be vulnerable in some of those feelings, and for executives, for leaders to look at themselves, and rather than pushing this kind of leadership of having to be perfect and polished all the time and have all of the answers, look at themselves and say, oh, okay, wow, I'm maybe not showing up in a role that is consistent with my values, and I want to be able to dive into that a little deeper. So I think any conversation has to come from a place of, what can I learn from this interaction, and how can I own, my own inconsistencies, if that makes sense?
Yeah, there's a massive division, I think, in ideology right now in general, among activists, among business folks in general, that there's two ways to go about any of these situations: radical change or incremental progress. Yeah. And I definitely think both of those have to be held in juxtaposition with each other. And we ought to talk and flesh out the details of what a radical shift in our businesses would look like to be more sustainable, but at the same time, reducing a barrier of entry for people who do want to participate is so important.
Definitely. Though it's difficult, especially now in 2020, to have conversations about things that are difficult, primarily from the perspective that a lot of times people aren't willing to budge. If you talk to your parents, we've seen this in America a lot since there's a lot of stuff happening recently, but the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, is a big, big topic of conversation here. And if one person doesn't agree with the other person, odds are 9 times out of 10, they're not going to change their ways. So to segue back to the climate change sort of conversation, how have you gone about changing people's minds who don't actually want to change their minds?
Great question. So I would say that as a communicator, you have to speak to what that person cares about. Now, we care about the issues. We're passionate about the issues, right? We stake so much of our identities on fighting for the causes that we care about. And that often leads to the presumption that other people will care about the same issues for the same reasons. I had a very clear example of this. You guys talked about going plant-based. That was definitely my first kind of stand, my activist stand when I was young. And so I told my parents, made a grand, announcement that I was going vegetarian. And I was about 11 at the time. for background, my dad is French and he's also a chef. And so to come out as a vegetarian was almost like a betrayal of so much of his culture and what he cared about. And like his real way of connecting with us as children was to cook for us. And that was the thing that brought the family together. So in many ways, he felt that I was rejecting something much more than, food, but his identity and his culture. And that meant that vegetarianism was a really heated topic of conversation. It, pervaded every conversation around the dinner table for not just like a few months, but like years of my life. And I didn't realize until I started working at Impossible Foods, this company that makes meat from plants. I didn't realize that I was taking the wrong route and trying to convince him or trying to find some kind of like shared ground, right? I was arguing it from the perspective of why I cared about the issue. It was like moral grounds and like ethics, and like it's something that's very hard to debate on, right? Because it's very slippery, right? And it's very open to interpretation. And yet when I started working with Impossible Foods, I started doing the research into, the environmental impact of the meat industry, the health impacts of, a high meat consumption diet. And the moment I started speaking from that objective lens, not from a very highly charged emotional place, but from, here are just the facts and statistics that I can actually back up, we were, for the first time in my life, able to find some kind of common ground. And he's like, oh, okay, I get it now, right? This was a really important lesson for me growing up, because I realized that communicating is understanding what your audience values, understanding what they care about. And back to this point of polarization, like so often what gets in the way is that we only see the differences between us. We don't draw it back to the baseline values. And like ultimately there are some very universal values that we all can kind of rally behind and care about around our families, around our communities, around, contribution. It's very easy to understand kind of what's going wrong in society and why we need to all show up from a place of those universal kind of values. So I think starting there is really, really effective. And I would say that universally, the most compelling argument is this one around children. And this has been my experience working with corporates, but also working with family members who might have very different perspectives. It's drawing it back to, what is the world that you want to pass on to your children? And what do you want? What kind of future do you want your children to inherit? And what's been really striking is that in every conversation with a group of executives, when asked what their catalyst was for caring about climate change, consistently it has been their kids coming home at the end of the day and saying, mom, dad, auntie, uncle, whoever it is, what are you doing about the climate crisis? And what are you doing to safeguard my future? So there was real power in that, and stripping it back to what makes us human and what makes us brilliant and what makes us connected is a really, really good way about going about what can otherwise be very divisive conversations.
Yeah, communication skills I think are integral, and it's a learned process. I think many of us have this assumption that we can just speak to someone once and then everything will change. And I believe there's a statistic that runs around among politicians that basically says you have to hear my name 7 times before you even know who I am. And I think the same is true of these difficult conversations. It's not a one-off break in event and everything will change. You have to have a continuous conversation.